Harlem, New York. It was 11:50 p.m. on Tuesday, September 19, 1929, when 6 men working for Bumpy Johnson's organization confronted 4 Irish gangsters outside a speakeasy on 137th Street, a confrontation that would last approximately 3 minutes, that would result in 2 of the Irish gangsters being hospitalized with serious injuries including broken bones and stab wounds, and that would send a clear message to Patrick Riley and his West Side Irish gang that their attempts to take over several Harlem speakeasies through violence and intimidation had seriously miscalculated the protection and resources available to Johnson's operation. The Irish gang had been operating in Harlem for approximately 2 weeks, threatening establishment owners with property destruction and physical violence unless they agreed to purchase beer and liquor from Riley's organization rather than from Johnson's operation, apparently believing that Johnson's claimed connection to Al Capone in Chicago was exaggeration or bluff rather than a genuine partnership that commanded resources and enforcement mechanisms, extending far beyond Harlem's boundaries. Johnson had initially attempted to resolve the situation through negotiation, sending word to Riley that the speakeasies being targeted were part of a Chicago-protected distribution network and that continued interference would create serious problems for the Irish gang, but Riley had ignored these warnings and had continued his violent campaign, believing that a young black operator in Harlem could not possibly have the kind of backing that would justify the threats being made. The September 19th confrontation demonstrated that Johnson could and would defend his territory with professional violence when negotiation failed, but the more important demonstration would come 24 hours later when Frank Nitti in Chicago would contact Italian mob figures in New York, who had working relationships with the Irish gangs, explaining that the West Side Irish had violated territorial agreements and that Chicago expected immediate discipline and compensation, a message that would result in Riley being ordered by his own bosses to abandon Harlem completely and to apologize formally to Johnson's organization for the territorial violation. Harlem, New York. It was 3:15 p.m. on Thursday, March 22, 1929, when Dutch Schultz, the 30-year-old bootlegger who controlled beer distribution throughout the Bronx and much of Upper Manhattan, walked into a speakeasy on 125th Street near Lenox Avenue with 4 of his enforcers, intending to inform the owner that he would now be purchasing his beer and liquor exclusively from the Schultz organization rather than from whatever suppliers he'd been using, and that refusal to comply would result in the establishment being destroyed and the owner being hospitalized or worse. This was standard operating procedure for Schultz in March 1929, the method by which he'd taken control of hundreds of speakeasies throughout New York over the previous 3 years, using a combination of competitive pricing, reliable supply, and overwhelming violence to force independent operators and rival bootleggers out of business, and to build his empire into one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in the city, generating an estimated $2 million monthly from beer sales, numbers rackets, and various protection schemes. But what Schultz didn't know, what nobody had bothered to tell him before he walked into that Harlem speakeasy on March 22nd, was that the establishment he was attempting to take over had been purchasing its beer and liquor from Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's distribution operation since late November 1928, which meant it was protected by an arrangement that Schultz's organization could not simply ignore without facing consequences that extended far beyond Harlem's borders. The speakeasy owner, a 45-year-old man named Marcus Webb who'd been operating the establishment since 1924 and who'd switched to Johnson's supply operation 3 months earlier because of better prices and more reliable deliveries, listened politely as Schultz explained the new arrangement, nodded as though he understood and accepted the terms, and then said something that changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Schultz," Webb said, according to multiple witnesses who were present that Thursday afternoon and who later provided accounts to various journalists and law enforcement officials who investigated the incident. "But I already have a supplier who provides excellent service at competitive prices, and I am satisfied with the current arrangement. I understand you are a powerful man with extensive resources, but my current supplier also has powerful connections, and I would prefer not to create problems by switching suppliers without very compelling reasons." Schultz, who was not accustomed to being refused, and who had a reputation for extreme violence when his demands were not immediately accepted, responded with the casual menace that had made him one of the most feared criminals in New York. "I don't think you understand the situation, Webb. You will buy beer from my organization starting next week, or your establishment will experience unfortunate accidents that will make it impossible for you to operate. Windows will break, deliveries will be disrupted, customers will be harassed, and if you continue to refuse after these initial warnings, more serious problems will develop that might affect your health and your ability to continue operating any business in New York. This is not a negotiation, this is an instruction." Webb remained calm, which surprised Schultz and his enforcers, who expected the standard response of fearful compliance that they'd encountered hundreds of times before when making similar demands. "My supplier is Bumpy Johnson," Webb said quietly. "He works with Al Capone's organization in Chicago. Perhaps you should speak with Mr. Johnson before you make decisions about establishments that are already being serviced by his operation. I would not want you to create problems with Chicago without understanding the full situation." The mention of Capone's name changed the atmosphere in the speakeasy instantly. Schultz's enforcers, who moments earlier had been prepared to begin breaking furniture and threatening physical violence, suddenly looked uncertain, glancing at each other and then at Schultz, waiting for instructions about how to proceed. Schultz himself paused, clearly surprised by the information and calculating whether it was true or whether Webb was simply invoking Capone's name as a bluff to avoid being forced into Schultz's distribution network. "We will verify this information," Schultz said finally, his tone less threatening than it had been moments earlier. "If what you say is accurate, then we will need to discuss arrangements with Johnson and with his Chicago associates. If you are lying to me, you will discover that invoking Capone's name without authorization carries even more serious consequences than simply refusing my offer." Schultz and his men left the speakeasy without taking any further action, and according to multiple accounts, Schultz spent the remainder of Thursday afternoon and all day Friday, March 23rd, making inquiries about Johnson's operation, about his relationship with Capone, and about whether the claim that Harlem speakeasies purchasing from Johnson were protected by Chicago's most powerful bootlegger was legitimate or merely a rumor that Johnson had spread to discourage competition. By Saturday morning, March 24, 1929, Schultz had confirmed through multiple sources that Johnson did indeed have a formal partnership with Capone's organization, that the arrangement had been established in November 1928 following Johnson's trip to Chicago, that Capone was providing beer and liquor at wholesale prices, and that Johnson was distributing throughout Harlem, and most importantly, that Capone had made clear to other bootleggers operating in New York, including several Italian mob figures who had connections to both Chicago and New York operations, that Harlem was Johnson's territory and that interference with Johnson's business would be considered interference with Capone's business. This last piece of information was critical, because it meant that Schultz could not simply use violence to take over Johnson's customers the way he'd taken over hundreds of other establishments. Any action against Johnson's operation would potentially trigger a response from Capone, and Schultz, despite his violent reputation and substantial resources, understood that going to war with Chicago's most powerful bootlegger over a relatively small territory in Harlem would be strategically foolish and potentially suicidal. Schultz requested a meeting with Johnson, and the two men met on Monday afternoon, March 26, 1929, at a neutral location, a restaurant on 133rd Street, that was not controlled by either man's organization. The meeting was attended by Schultz and two of his associates, by Johnson and William "Bub" Hewlett, and by Frank Nitty's representative from Chicago, a man named Michael Rossetti, who'd been sent to New York specifically to attend this meeting and to ensure that Johnson's interests were protected in any negotiation with Schultz. Rossetti's presence at the meeting sent a clear message that Chicago was taking the situation seriously and that Schultz would need to negotiate rather than simply impose his will through violence and intimidation. According to multiple accounts of the meeting, including detailed testimony that Schultz later provided to law enforcement officials when he was being investigated for tax evasion, the negotiation was tense but ultimately resulted in an agreement that established clear territorial boundaries between Schultz's operations and Johnson's operations in Harlem. Schultz opened the meeting by explaining that he controlled beer distribution throughout the Bronx and much of Upper Manhattan, that he'd been expanding into Harlem gradually over the previous year, and that he had not been aware that Johnson had established a formal partnership with Capone's organization that gave Johnson exclusive distribution rights in the black neighborhoods of Uptown Manhattan. This was partially true and partially diplomatic fiction. Schultz had heard rumors about Johnson's Chicago connections, but he'd dismissed them as exaggeration and had assumed that Johnson was just another small-time black bootlegger who could be easily intimidated or eliminated if he refused to accept subordination to Schultz's organization. The discovery that Johnson actually had Capone's backing and that Chicago was willing to send a representative to New York to attend negotiation meetings forced Schultz to reconsider his assumptions and to treat Johnson as a legitimate competitor rather than as someone who could be casually crushed. Johnson's position was straightforward and non-negotiable. "I have been distributing beer and liquor in Harlem since November 1928, he explained. "My operation services approximately 75 establishments currently, with plans to expand to 100 or more by the end of this year. I purchase product from Mr. Capone's organization in Chicago, and I have his commitment that my territory in Harlem will be protected from interference, I am not looking to expand beyond Harlem into the Bronx or into other areas where you already have established operations. I am content to build my business in the black neighborhoods where I have natural advantages due to my relationships with the community and where you would face significant difficulties operators effectively. But I will not accept demands that my customers switch to your organization, and I will not agree to pay tribute or percentages to your operation for the right to conduct business in my own territory. This is non-negotiable, and if you attempt to force the issue through violence or intimidation, you will be dealing with Chicago, not just with me personally. Schultz initially pushed back, arguing that he had been operating in parts of Harlem before Johnson established his distribution network, that some establishments currently buying from Johnson had previously bought from Schultz's suppliers, and that Johnson's rapid expansion was cutting into revenues that Schultz had expected to capture as he extended his operations throughout Upper Manhattan. But Rossetti, the Chicago representative, intervened with a statement that ended any possibility of Schultz using violence to resolve the territorial dispute. Mr. Capone has made a significant investment in Mr. Johnson's operation, Rossetti explained, his tone polite but firm. Chicago supplies product at favorable wholesale prices, provides logistical support, and most importantly, provides protection for Mr. Johnson's business interests in Harlem. This protection is not limited to local threats. It extends to anyone, regardless of their resources or connections, who attempts to interfere with Mr. Johnson's operation through violence, intimidation, or unfair business practices. Mr. Capone considers Harlem to be Johnson's territory, and any action against Johnson's operation will be treated as action against Chicago's interests. We understand that you have substantial resources, Mr. Schultz, and we respect your position in New York. But we need to be very clear that if you choose to pursue this conflict, you will not be fighting just a local operator in Harlem. You will be fighting Chicago, and that is a war that nobody wins, especially over a relatively small territory that generates perhaps $20,000 to $30,000 monthly in revenues, which is a fraction of what both our organizations earn from other operations. The smart approach, the business-like approach, is to recognize that Harlem is Johnson's territory, that the rest of Upper Manhattan and the Bronx remain your territory, and that both operations can coexist profitably without the violence and disruption that would result from a territorial war. Schultz, who was violent but not stupid, understood immediately that he was being offered a face-saving compromise that would allow him to avoid war with Chicago while maintaining his control over his existing operations. After approximately 90 minutes of discussion, the three men reached an agreement that established clear boundaries and that, most importantly, established the precedent that Johnson's Harlem operation was protected by Chicago, and that white bootleggers could not simply take over black-controlled territories through violence and intimidation the way they'd done in other cities, neighborhoods throughout the 1920s. The agreement specified that Johnson would have exclusive rights to distribute beer and liquor to speakeasies, restaurants, hotels, and nightclubs in Harlem, defined as the area north of 110th Street and south of 155th Street between 5th Avenue and the Harlem River, covering the predominantly black neighborhoods that constituted the heart of Harlem in 1929. Schultz would maintain his operations in the Bronx and in the white neighborhoods of Upper Manhattan, including Washington Heights and Yorkville, and would not attempt to force Johnson's customers to switch suppliers. Establishments located in mixed or transitional neighborhoods could choose which supplier they preferred, with neither organization using violence or intimidation to influence these choices. Any disputes about specific establishments or about territorial boundaries would be resolved through negotiation rather than violence, with Rossetti or another Chicago representative serving as mediator if necessary. And most importantly, the agreement specified that both men would respect each other's territories and would not support or encourage third parties to cause problems in the other's territory. This last provision was critical, because it prevented Schultz from using proxies to attack Johnson's operation while maintaining plausible deniability, and it gave Johnson clear recourse through Chicago if Schultz violated the spirit of the agreement, even if he adhered to its technical terms. The March 26th meeting and the agreement that resulted from it represented a watershed moment in New York organized crime, the first time that a black criminal operator had negotiated as an equal with a major white bootlegger, the first time that territorial boundaries had been established that recognized black control over a significant geographic area, and most importantly, the first time that a major white mobster had been forced to back down from territorial expansion plans because of a black operator's connections to a more powerful white organization. The story of what happened in late March 1929 spread rapidly through New York's criminal underworld, and the message was clear. Bumpy Johnson had protection from Chicago, and anyone who interfered with his Harlem operation would face consequences that extended far beyond local rivalries. for white bootleggers and mob figures who'd grown accustomed to treating black criminals as subordinates who could be intimidated, exploited, or eliminated without serious consequences. The Johnson-Schultz negotiation represented a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of organized crime. The respect that Schultz had been forced to show Johnson was not based on Johnson's personal power, which in March 1929 was still relatively limited compared to major white gangsters, but rather on Johnson's connection to Al Capone and on the understanding that attacking Johnson meant attacking Chicago. This precedent would prove enormously important over the following years as Johnson built his operation and as other white mobsters contemplated moving into Harlem's lucrative criminal economy. Word reached Al Capone in Chicago about the March meeting within 48 hours, and Capone's response, communicated through Frank Nitti to Rossetti and then to Johnson, indicated that Capone was pleased with how the situation had been handled. Nitti sent Johnson a telegram on Wednesday, March 28 that read, quote, "Mr. Capone congratulates you on successful negotiation with Dutch. You handled situation professionally and achieved favorable outcome without violence. This demonstrates that you understand business principles and strategic thinking. Continue building your operation in Harlem. Chicago will provide support and protection as needed. Boundaries established with Dutch should be respected by all parties. If problems arise, contact us immediately. Regards, Nitti." End quote. The telegram, which Johnson saved and which was later found among his papers after his death in 1968, represented formal confirmation that Chicago recognized the importance of the territorial agreement and that Capone was committed to enforcing the boundaries that had been negotiated. The respect that the March 1929 agreement commanded was tested multiple times over the following months and years, as various white mobsters, criminal organizations, and independent bootleggers attempted to move into Harlem or to force Johnson's customers to switch suppliers, only to discover that Johnson's Chicago protection was real and that violating the territorial agreement carried serious consequences. In May 1929, 2 Italian bootleggers from Brooklyn attempted to sell beer to 3 Harlem speakeasies that were purchasing from Johnson's operation, offering prices that undercut Johnson by approximately 15% and suggesting that the establishment owners would be wise to switch suppliers before problems developed. The speakeasy owners, who'd been trained by Johnson's organization to report any such approaches immediately, contacted Johnson within hours. Johnson sent word to Frank Nitti in Chicago, explaining the situation and requesting guidance about how to handle Brooklyn bootleggers who were apparently unaware of the territorial agreements. Nitti's response came back within 24 hours. The Brooklyn operators should be informed that Harlem is Chicago's territory through Johnson's operation, Nitti wrote. If they do not immediately cease their activities in Harlem, Chicago will contact their bosses in Brooklyn and make clear that continued interference will create problems for Brooklyn's relationship with Chicago in other business matters. This is not a threat, it is simply making clear that territorial agreements must be respected by all parties, and that organizations attempting to operate in protected territories will face consequences that extend beyond local disputes. Johnson arranged a meeting with the 2 Brooklyn bootleggers, explained the situation, showed them Nitti's message as proof that Chicago was backing his operation, and gave them a simple choice: leave Harlem immediately and permanently, or face consequences that would involve not just Johnson's organization but Chicago's substantial resources and influence with Brooklyn's mob leadership. The 2 bootleggers, who were small operators working for larger Brooklyn organizations, understood immediately that they'd made a serious mistake by operating in Harlem without first checking whether the territory was protected. They left Harlem that same day and never returned, and according to sources in Brooklyn's criminal underworld, they were severely disciplined by their own bosses for creating potential problems with Chicago over a small-scale bootlegging operation that wasn't worth the political complications. In September 1929, a more serious challenge emerged when a group of Irish gangsters from the West Side, led by a criminal named Patrick Riley, attempted to take over several Harlem speakeasies through violence, sending armed men to threaten establishment owners and to destroy property until the owners agreed to purchase beer and liquor from Riley's organization. Riley had apparently heard about Johnson's Chicago connection, but had dismissed it as exaggeration, believing that Capone would not actually intervene in a local dispute in Harlem over a few speakeasies. This was a serious miscalculation. Johnson responded to the Irish gang's violence by first attempting negotiation, sending word to Riley that the speakeasies being targeted were part of Johnson's distribution network and that the violence needed to stop immediately. Riley ignored the warning and continued the campaign of intimidation, apparently believing that Johnson was bluffing about Chicago's support or that Capone would not care about a small-scale territorial dispute in Harlem. Johnson then contacted Nitti, explained that the Irish gang had been warned but had continued their violent activities, and requested permission to respond with force. Nitty's reply authorized Johnson to defend his territory but specified that the response should be measured and should avoid escalation that might draw unwanted attention from law enforcement. Johnson sent a team of 6 men, including several who'd received training from Chicago enforcers during visits to the Midwest, to confront Riley's gang. The confrontation occurred on September 19, 1929, outside a speakeasy on 137th Street where Riley's men were preparing to make another intimidation visit. Johnson's men intercepted them on the street, and according to witnesses, what followed was a brief but violent encounter that left 2 of Riley's enforcers hospitalized with serious injuries and sent a clear message that Johnson's operation could and would defend itself with professional violence when necessary. But the more important message came 24 hours later when Frank Nitti contacted several Italian mob figures in New York who had working relationships with the Irish gangs, explaining that the West Side Irish had violated a Chicago-protected territory and that Chicago expected the Irish leadership to discipline Riley and to ensure that no further incursions into Harlem occurred. The Italian mobsters, who valued their relationships with Chicago and who understood that Capone's organization could make problems for their own operations if they didn't respond appropriately, put pressure on the Irish gang leadership to shut down Riley's Harlem operation immediately. Within 72 hours of the street confrontation, Riley had been ordered by his own bosses to abandon any plans for operating in Harlem. To pay compensation to the speakeasy owners his men had threatened, and to issue a formal apology to Johnson's organization for the territorial violation. The speed and completeness of the Irish retreat demonstrated to New York's criminal underworld that Chicago's protection of Johnson's operation was not merely symbolic but involved actual enforcement, mechanisms that could mobilize multiple organizations to respond to violations of the territorial agreements. The September incident also demonstrated something else that would prove important in the years that followed. Chicago was willing to use its influence with Italian mob figures in New York to protect Johnson's operation, even when the threat came from non-Italian criminals like the Irish gangs. This meant that Johnson's protection extended beyond just Italian disputes and covered threats from any criminal organization regardless of ethnic composition. This broad protection made Johnson's position in Harlem far more secure than it would have been if he'd only had protection against Italian competitors, and it meant that white mobsters from any background had to respect the boundaries that had been established in March 1929. By the end of 1929, approximately 9 months after the initial Schultz negotiation, Johnson's Harlem operation was servicing over 100 establishments, generating weekly revenues of approximately $18,000 to $25,000, and had established a reputation as untouchable due to Chicago protection. White bootleggers operating in New York had learned through multiple incidents that attempting to move into Harlem meant confronting not just Johnson's local organization but Chicago's extensive resources and influence, and that the costs of such a confrontation far exceeded any potential benefits from capturing a relatively small territory that generated modest profits compared to the massive bootlegging operations in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. The respect that Johnson commanded by late 1929 was grudging in many cases, because white mobsters resented being forced to treat a black operator as an equal and to acknowledge that they could not simply take over territory that they viewed as naturally subordinate to white control. But the respect was real and it was enforced because Chicago made clear that violating the territorial agreements would have consequences that extended far beyond Harlem's boundaries. The Johnson-Capone arrangement also began to influence how other white mobsters thought about territorial agreements and about relationships with black criminals in general. If Chicago was willing to protect a black operator's territory and to enforce boundaries that prevented white mobsters from expanding into black neighborhoods, then perhaps the traditional assumption that black criminals would always be subordinate to white control needed to be reconsidered. This was revolutionary thinking in 1929 America, where racial segregation was enforced by law in the South and by custom in the North, where black people were systematically excluded from most legitimate economic opportunities, and where the idea of black criminals operating as equals with white criminals would have seemed absurd to most people. But organized crime was different from legitimate society in important ways. Criminals judged each other based on competence, on the ability to generate revenue, on connections and resources, and on the capacity for violence when necessary. Race mattered in organized crime, but it mattered less than in the legitimate economy, because criminal organizations needed talented people regardless of their ethnic background, and because rigid racial hierarchies sometimes interfered with profitable operations. Capone's willingness to partner with Johnson and to protect his Harlem territory was based on business logic rather than on any progressive racial views. Capone recognized that Johnson could operate effectively in Harlem in ways that white bootleggers could not, that Johnson's local connections and community relationships gave him natural advantages in servicing black establishments, and that protecting Johnson's operation was more profitable than trying to control Harlem directly through white operatives who would face resistance from the black community. The most significant test of the respect that the Johnson-Capone arrangement commanded came in the early 1930s, during the period when Prohibition was ending and when white mobsters were looking for new sources of revenue to replace the enormous profits from bootlegging. Dutch Schultz, who'd respected the March 1929 territorial agreement while bootlegging was still highly profitable, began to focus on Harlem's numbers rackets in 1931 and 1932, recognizing that illegal gambling would continue to generate substantial revenues even after Prohibition was repealed. The numbers rackets in Harlem by 1931 were generating an estimated $800,000 to $1 million annually, with dozens of policy banks controlled by black operators, including Madame Stephanie St. Clair, Caspar Holstein, and various smaller operators who ran neighborhood gambling operations. Johnson had maintained his bootlegging distribution network but had also been building connections to the numbers operators, providing security services, helping to resolve disputes, and positioning himself to move into numbers operations when bootlegging revenues declined. Schultz saw the same opportunity, but unlike bootlegging, where territorial agreements had been negotiated and where Chicago's protection of Johnson's operation had been clearly established, the numbers rackets had operated with less formal structure and with fewer territorial agreements between white and black operators. Schultz believed, not unreasonably, that the bootlegging territorial agreements might not apply to gambling operations, and that he could move into Harlem's numbers rackets without violating the understanding that had been reached with Chicago in 1929. This calculation proved to be incorrect, but Schultz wouldn't discover his mistake until he'd already committed substantial resources and had already generated significant resistance from Harlem's black numbers operators. Schultz's campaign to take over Harlem's numbers rackets began in earnest in 1932, using the same combination of competitive pricing, political protection through his relationships with corrupt Tammany Hall officials, and overwhelming violence that had worked effectively in his bootlegging operations. He offered black policy bank operators a choice. They could continue running their operations but would pay 40% of their profits to Schultz's organization in exchange for political protection and access to higher-level financing, or they could refuse and face violence, legal harassment through corrupt police officials, and the likelihood that their operations would be destroyed and taken over by Schultz's organization. Many black operators, facing the prospect of fighting a powerful white mobster who controlled corrupt politicians and police officials, reluctantly accepted Schultz's demands, believing that paying tribute was preferable to being eliminated entirely. But several operators resisted, most notably Madame Stephanie St. Clair, who'd built one of the most successful policy banks in Harlem and who refused to subordinate her operation to white control. St. Clair hired Bumpy Johnson as her chief enforcer and bodyguard, tasking him with organizing resistance to Schultz's takeover attempt and with protecting her operation from the violence that Schultz was using to force compliance. Johnson recognized immediately that resisting Schultz would require more than just local muscle and street-level fighting. Schultz had substantial resources, political protection, and a willingness to use extreme violence to achieve his objectives. Johnson needed leverage that extended beyond Harlem, and the obvious source of that leverage was Chicago and the relationship he'd built with Capone's organization during the bootlegging years. In October 1932, approximately 6 months into Schultz's campaign to take over Harlem's numbers rackets, Johnson contacted Frank Nitti in Chicago, explaining the situation and asking whether Chicago's protection of his Harlem operations extended to gambling as well as to bootlegging. The response he received was not what he'd hoped for, but was brutally honest about the limits of Chicago's support. Nitti's message, delivered by telegram on October 15, 1932, explained that the situation with Schultz and the numbers rackets was more complicated than the bootlegging territorial disputes had been. Mr. Capone's organization has provided protection for your bootlegging distribution operation in Harlem based on our business partnership and on the revenue that operation generates for Chicago, Nitti wrote. However, the numbers rackets are a different matter. We do not have a direct financial interest in Harlem's gambling operations, and we do not have the same clear business justification for intervening in disputes between Dutch Schultz and the black policy bank operators. This does not mean we are abandoning you, but it means we cannot provide the same level of direct protection that we provided during the bootlegging disputes. What we can do is make clear to Schultz and to the Italian mob figures in New York, who have working relationships with Schultz, that Chicago considers you to be a valuable business partner, that we would prefer that Schultz negotiate with you, rather than simply using violence to take over all of Harlem's gambling operations, and that we hope the situation can be resolved in ways that allow you and other black operators to maintain some autonomy, rather than being completely subordinated to Schultz's control. We will also make clear that if Schultz uses violence against you personally or attempts to eliminate you to clear the way for complete takeover, Chicago will consider that a violation of our understanding that you are a protected partner. In other words, we will help protect you personally and will try to influence negotiations, but we cannot and will not go to war with Schultz over Harlem's numbers rackets the way we would have if he'd violated your bootlegging territory. You will need to fight for the numbers operations largely on your own, but you will have Chicago's political support and the understanding that Schultz cannot simply eliminate you without creating problems for himself with Chicago. This is the best we can offer given the circumstances. Use this support wisely and look for opportunities to negotiate arrangements that allow you to maintain position even if you cannot prevent Schultz from taking some share of Harlem's gambling revenues. This response was disappointing to Johnson, who'd hoped that Chicago would provide the same robust protection for numbers operations that they'd provided for bootlegging, but it was also realistic about the limits of what Capone's organization would do for a business partner when their own financial interests were not directly threatened. Johnson understood that he would need to fight Schultz primarily through local resources, through organizing other black operators to resist collectively, and through creative tactics that raised the cost of Schultz's takeover attempt without triggering the kind of all-out war that Harlem's black operators could not win. But he also understood that Chicago's partial support, the indication that Schultz could not simply kill Johnson without consequences, gave him more protection than most black criminals could ever hope to have when facing a powerful white mobster, and that he could use Chicago's name strategically even if he couldn't rely on Chicago to send enforcers or to intervene directly in the numbers war. Johnson's strategy for resisting Schultz combined guerrilla warfare, political maneuvering, and strategic use of his Chicago connections to raise the costs of Schultz's takeover and to position himself as a negotiator who could deliver peace between Schultz and the black policy bank operators. Throughout late 1932 and 1933, Johnson led attacks against Schultz's collection operations in Harlem, kidnapping and sometimes killing Schultz's enforcers who were collecting tribute from black policy banks, bombing several locations where Schultz's organization was operating gambling operations, and generally making it clear that taking over Harlem's numbers rackets would not be as easy as Schultz had anticipated. These attacks were carefully calibrated to avoid escalating to the level where Schultz would decide to eliminate Johnson completely, but they were serious enough to cause real problems for Schultz's operations and to demonstrate that continued resistance was possible even against a much more powerful opponent. At the same time, Johnson worked to organize other black policy bank operators into a loose coalition that could negotiate collectively with Schultz rather than being picked off individually. This was difficult because many operators were primarily concerned with preserving their own positions and were willing to accept Schultz's terms if it meant avoiding violence. But Johnson argued persuasively that collective resistance would give them better negotiating positions than individual surrender, and that Chicago's support, even if limited, gave them leverage that they wouldn't have if they were fighting entirely on their own. Johnson also used his Chicago connections to influence discussions between Schultz and Italian mob figures who were beginning to consolidate their own power in New York. Through Nitti, Johnson arranged for Charles Lucky Luciano, who was emerging as the most powerful Italian mobster in New York in the early 1930s, to receive information about Johnson's capabilities, his connections to Chicago, and his value as a potential partner who could manage Harlem operations more effectively than Schultz's heavy-handed approach was managing them. This was strategic positioning for a future that Johnson could already see coming, the eventual murder or elimination of Schultz, and the opportunity to negotiate new arrangements with whoever took over Schultz's operations. The critical moment came in October 1935, when Schultz was murdered by assassins working for the Italian mob, specifically for Lucky Luciano and the newly formed commission that governed organized crime in New York. Schultz's murder was not directly related to his Harlem operations. He was killed primarily because he'd threatened to assassinate Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, who was investigating mob activities, and because the commission had decided that Schultz's plan to kill Dewey would bring too much law enforcement attention to organized crime. But Schultz's death created an immediate power vacuum in Harlem's numbers rackets, and Johnson moved quickly to position himself as the person who could negotiate new arrangements with Luciano and the Italian mob. In November 1935, approximately 3 weeks after Schultz's murder, Johnson arranged a meeting with Luciano through intermediaries provided by Frank Nitti in Chicago. The meeting took place in a Manhattan restaurant attended by Johnson, by Luciano, and by representatives from Chicago who were there specifically to remind Luciano that Johnson had Chicago's support and that any arrangements made for Harlem should recognize Johnson's position and his connections to Capone's organization. The negotiations lasted several hours and resulted in an agreement that would govern Harlem's criminal economy for the next 3 decades. Johnson would control day-to-day operations of the numbers rackets in Harlem, managing the policy banks, collecting revenues, handling street-level enforcement, and serving as the primary contact between the black community and the Italian mob. Luciano's organization, later formalized as the Genovese crime family, would receive approximately 30% of the net profits from Harlem's gambling operations in exchange for political protection, access to higher-level financing when policy banks needed to cover large payouts, and general oversight that would prevent other white criminal organizations from attempting to take over Harlem. Johnson would maintain significant autonomy in how he managed Harlem operations, with the understanding that he would consult with the Italian mob on major decisions, but would have day-to-day control over the details of running the gambling businesses. And critically, the agreement specified that Johnson's position was protected by both the Italian mob and by Chicago, meaning that no one within the New York criminal hierarchy could eliminate or replace Johnson without approval from both Luciano and from Capone's organization. This last provision was Frank Nitti's contribution to the negotiation, his way of ensuring that Chicago's investment in Johnson's development over the previous 7 years would be protected even though Chicago did not have direct financial interest in Harlem's gambling operations. The November 1935 agreement represented the culmination of everything that had begun with Johnson's November 1928 meeting with Capone in Chicago. The respect that white mobsters had been forced to show Johnson during the bootlegging years, the territorial boundaries that had been established and enforced through Chicago's power and influence, the understanding that Johnson could not be eliminated casually without creating problems with Chicago, all of these factors contributed to Johnson's ability to negotiate a favorable arrangement with Luciano after Schultz's death. Without Chicago's protection and without the precedents that had been established during the bootlegging years, Johnson would almost certainly have been subordinated completely to Italian control or eliminated as a potential source of resistance, the way black operators in other cities were typically treated when white mobs moved into black neighborhoods. But because Capone had decided in November 1928 to treat Johnson as a business partner rather than as a subordinate, and because Chicago had consistently enforced the principle that Johnson's operations deserved respect and protection, Johnson had been able to build a position of genuine power that white mobsters in New York could not simply ignore or eliminate. The respect that Johnson commanded by late 1935 was no longer dependent solely on Chicago's active protection. 7 years of successful operations, of professional business practices, of strategic violence when necessary, and of demonstrated ability to manage complex criminal enterprises had established Johnson's reputation independently of his Chicago connections. But everyone involved in New York organized crime understood that Chicago's support had been essential to Johnson's rise, that the boundaries established in 1929 had created the space for Johnson to build his operation without being crushed by more powerful white competitors, and that the precedent of respecting Johnson's territory and treating him as a legitimate negotiating partner rather than as a subordinate to be exploited or eliminated had fundamentally changed the dynamics of how black and white criminals interacted in New York's underworld. The story of how Al Capone and Bumpy Johnson made a deal in 1928 and how every white mobster had to respect it became part of the oral history of New York organized crime, a tale that demonstrated several important principles about power, respect, and the sometimes surprising ways that criminal enterprises operated across racial lines in ways that legitimate society rarely matched. The first principle was that power in organized crime came not just from violence and intimidation but from strategic alliances and from the credibility that came with powerful backing. Johnson in 1928 had been a relatively minor criminal operator with limited resources and local influence in Harlem. But Capone's decision to partner with him and to provide protection and resources transformed Johnson's position completely, giving him leverage that he could never have achieved on his own and forcing white mobsters to treat him with respect that would have been unthinkable if he'd been operating independently. The second principle was that territorial agreements mattered and could be enforced if the parties backing those agreements had sufficient power and determination. The March 1929 agreement between Johnson and Schultz, mediated by Chicago's representative, established boundaries that were respected for years because everyone understood that violating those boundaries meant confronting Chicago, and because the costs of such a confrontation exceeded the benefits of capturing Harlem's relatively modest criminal revenues. This was not idealism or racial progressivism. It was cold business calculation that recognized territorial boundaries were more profitable than constant warfare, and that treating Johnson's operation with respect was less expensive than trying to eliminate it. The third principle was that organized crime sometimes offered opportunities for black advancement that were impossible in legitimate society. Johnson could never have become a powerful businessman in legitimate industries in 1928 America, where racial discrimination excluded black people from most economic opportunities, and where even successful black professionals faced constant obstacles and limitations. But in organized crime, competence and connections mattered more than race, and Capone's willingness to partner with a talented black criminal created possibilities that would have been impossible in any legitimate business context. The fourth principle was that respect in criminal enterprises was always contingent and always needed to be reinforced through demonstrated competence and through strategic use of backing and resources. Johnson's respect from white mobsters in the early years came primarily from his Chicago connections. But as he built his operation and demonstrated his abilities over time, his respect increasingly came from his own achievements and reputation. By the 1940s and 50s, white mobsters respected Johnson not primarily because of his historical connection to Capone, who was imprisoned in 1931 and died in 1947, but because Johnson had proven himself as a competent and reliable partner who could manage complex operations, who honored agreements, who could be ruthless when necessary, but who preferred negotiation to violence, and who commanded genuine loyalty from Harlem's black community in ways that white mobsters could never match. The Capone connection had provided the foundation for Johnson's rise, but Johnson himself had built on that foundation to create a position of genuine power that lasted until his death in 1968. The respect that the 1928 deal commanded extended beyond just the specific arrangements between Johnson and various white mobsters. It influenced how other black criminals thought about their possibilities and their relationships with white organized crime. If Johnson could negotiate as an equal with white mobsters and could maintain autonomy in Harlem while working within the larger structure of New York organized crime, then perhaps other black criminals could aspire to similar arrangements in their own neighborhoods and cities. This didn't mean that racial barriers in organized crime disappeared or that black criminals achieved full equality with their white counterparts. But it did mean that the absolute subordination that had characterized relationships between black and white criminals in earlier decades was no longer inevitable, and that talented black operators, with the right connections and the right strategic thinking, could carve out positions of genuine power and respect even in an environment dominated by white organized crime families. The legacy of the 1928 deal between Capone and Johnson extended far beyond the specific business arrangements and territorial agreements that were negotiated over the following years. It established a precedent for how powerful white criminals could work with talented black criminals as partners rather than as subordinates, how territorial boundaries could be negotiated and enforced across racial lines, how strategic alliances could provide protection and leverage that no individual operator could achieve alone, and how respect in criminal enterprises could sometimes transcend the racial barriers that governed legitimate society. For white mobsters in New York and other cities, the lesson of the Capone-Johnson partnership was that ignoring talented black criminals or assuming they could be easily subordinated was strategically foolish when those criminals had powerful backing and when they operated in communities where they had natural advantages. For black criminals in Harlem and elsewhere, the lesson was that strategic partnerships with powerful white organizations, when negotiated carefully and when backed by demonstrated competence, could provide opportunities for genuine power and autonomy that were impossible through purely local operations or through attempting to operate completely independently of white organized crime. The deal that Al Capone and Bumpy Johnson made in November 1928 changed organized crime in New York, not through any single dramatic event but through the accumulation of precedents and negotiations and demonstrations of power that established new patterns for how black and white criminals could interact, how territories could be divided and protected, and how respect could be earned and maintained across racial lines in an illegal economy that often operated according to different rules than legitimate society. Every white mobster who encountered Johnson after 1928, from Dutch Schultz negotiating territorial boundaries in March 1929 to Lucky Luciano arranging the numbers bracket agreement in November 1935 to countless other criminals who dealt with Johnson over the following 3 decades, had to respect the deal that Johnson had made with Capone, not because of any idealistic commitment to racial equality but because Chicago's power and Johnson's demonstrated competence made respecting that deal the smart business decision, and because organized crime, despite all its violence and ruthlessness, ultimately operated on business principles that sometimes allowed talented individuals to achieve power and respect regardless of the racial barriers that would have limited them in legitimate society. The respect commanded by the Capone-Johnson partnership also influenced how the Italian mob families in New York structured their relationships with black criminals more broadly. After the November 1935 agreement between Johnson and Luciano, the pattern that was established in Harlem, with black operators maintaining significant day-to-day autonomy while sharing profits with Italian mob families and while operating under the general oversight of the Commission, became a template that was applied in other black neighborhoods in New York and in other cities. This wasn't pure generosity or racial progressivism from the Italian mobs. It was recognition that black criminals with community connections and local knowledge could operate more effectively in black neighborhoods than white mobsters imposing control from outside, that arrangements allowing significant black autonomy while capturing a share of profits through tribute and oversight were more stable and more profitable than attempting to control every detail through direct Italian management. The Capone-Johnson deal had proven that such arrangements could work, that black operators could be reliable partners who honored agreements and who generated substantial revenues, and that treating talented black criminals with respect rather than attempting to crush them was good business. For Johnson personally, the respect that the 1928 deal commanded provided the foundation for a criminal career that lasted 4 decades and that made him into a legend, the godfather of Harlem, a man whose name would be known and remembered long after most of his white contemporaries were forgotten. Johnson understood that his power came partly from his own abilities and partly from the strategic partnerships he'd built, particularly the foundational partnership with Capone that had given him protection and credibility at the critical moment when he was building his operation. He never forgot that it was Capone's decision to treat him as a partner rather than as a subordinate that had made everything else possible, and he maintained his connections to Chicago even after Capone's imprisonment in 1931 and even after Capone's death in 1947, recognizing that those connections continued to provide leverage and respect long after the specific business arrangements had evolved or ended. When Johnson died of a heart attack on July 7, 1968, at Wells Restaurant in Harlem, surrounded by friends and associates who'd known him for decades, the respect he commanded was universal and genuine. Black criminals and legitimate community leaders in Harlem mourned the loss of a man who'd been both a ruthless gangster and a community protector, someone who'd helped poor families, who'd supported churches and schools, who'd provided jobs and opportunities in an economy that excluded black people from most legitimate paths to prosperity, and who demonstrated that black men could achieve power and respect even in environments dominated by white organizations and white assumptions of racial superiority. White mobsters from the Italian families that had worked with Johnson for decades sent representatives to his funeral, paying respects to a man who'd been a reliable partner, who'd honored agreements, who'd managed Harlem's criminal economy professionally for over 30 years, and who'd proven that the deal Capone made in November 1928, the decision to treat a young black enforcer as a legitimate business partner deserving of respect and protection, had been one of the smartest decisions in the history of American organized crime. The respect that every white mobster had to show Johnson was ultimately the respect that competence and strategic partnership commanded, the recognition that Johnson had built something genuine and valuable in Harlem, something that had lasted for decades and that had changed the dynamics of organized crime in ways that extended far beyond the specific business arrangements and territorial boundaries that were negotiated in the years following that first meeting in Chicago in November 1928. The deal between Al Capone and Bumpy Johnson changed Harlem, changed New York organized crime, and demonstrated that respect in the criminal underworld, like power itself, came not from racial hierarchy but from strategic thinking, from demonstrated ability, and from the intelligent use of partnerships and alliances that created possibilities and protection that no individual operator could achieve alone.